Hello and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are beginning our discussion on Brothers Sleep by Aldo Amparán. Today we'll be discussing an overview of the collection as well as the first half.
All right.
Well done.
Well done, Vanessa. Do you want to get us started on this overview and first half discussion?
Yeah. So this is his debut collection, I believe. Yeah.
Who's
Aldo?
Who's Aldo?
Yes.
The sweetest. So he's a professor at UTEP for creative writing. He just got the MFA, or not just, but he has his MFA in creative writing from UTEP as well. He's from here, from the Juarez, El Paso community. I took his class at UTEP before. It was one of my last classes I took.
So can we quiz you, like, as we read this and, like, oh yeah, so what is this here? Did you guys discuss this?
I guess we could.
I mean,
he used a lot of the styles that he talks about in his class, so that's really interesting.
I was talking about this with Raymond before we got here. There's a lot of attention to styles, and structure, but also breaking them. Yes, which will be fun to talk about.
Mm-hmm. He also plays with language a lot, which I loved. Yeah.
In this collection, you did mention it's his debut. It's also an award, right? So Ellis James Books, all awards yearly publication of a poetry manuscript. And so Aldo won 2021. Is this 2021, right?
No, 2020.
2020.
Yes.
Ellis James.
Mm-hmm. And it's being published this month.
Yes.
Yes, it says September.
Distributed, yeah.
Yes.
Well, Literarity
just got their copies.
Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty cool.
So it's on sale now.
Yeah, as of listening to this, you can go pick up a copy and support another local author, which is really great.
Yes, we love that.
Congratulations, Aldo. Yeah, so thank you for that little intro. We'll be asking you questions about Aldo's class and Aldo as a person throughout the podcast, I'm sure. Should we talk about the sections, like the table of contents?
Right. There's kind of, I mean, if you think about form and structure, there's 5 sections, but there's also a book ended by pieces that exist outside of those sections, right?
Yes.
Starting with the litany, and then, of course, the last piece too, right?
Yes.
And of course, a lot of these have been published elsewhere. At the City of Change was published online by the Academy of American Poets, March of 2021. And so I think we've mentioned a couple of other authors we've looked at have been published by them online. And it's a pretty cool, it's of notoriety. Alessandra also had her piece published there. So pretty good for a poet, right? To get seen by that many people. I might have also seen Imploded Vienna published at some. I mean, a lot of these are published in other places, right? That's the whole notes section.
In
there.
So what do we think of, I don't know, like overall impressions, gut reactions for these first 2 sections, I guess, that we'll talk about today?
There's just so much to say that I don't know what to say. I loved it. Just reading about here, El Paso and the violence in Juarez kind of, but also family relationships, and sexuality, and just the way that he plays with the language to convey these messages. And there's so much imagery throughout.
Yeah.
I think immediate connections with Alessandra's book. Just because that's fresh in my mind still.
Yeah.
And a lot of the poems about the violence in Juarez and stuff, it just reminded me. Did you see any other connections? Like, I know we're kind of jumping ahead, but
Right.
because Richie and I were talking about that earlier, like before the show.
Yeah. At this point, it's our name of the show before the show.
Just, you know, how a lot of these, and it's obvious because they're placed or grouped in these sections, right? But a lot of the poems, even in these first two sections, just really go together and have lots of like underlying connections,
Yeah.
you know, within the collection. So I was wondering, I don't know if you guys want to talk about that now or if you want to discuss connections to other poetry collections that we've read, other authors.
Yeah. Well, so my friend, we haven't read any of her work for this podcast, but my friend Natalie Center Sapico, I believe she gave a blurb for this, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So definitely check out Diverging Cities by
Yeah.
Natalie Center Sapico. And that's what I was
That's a
actually
great
going to allude
collection.
to. Because I feel like Aldo has similar way of poetically talking about the cities, their connections. Right? Natalie?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. She just called right now. No, but on top of that, it's both who are trained in MFA, who have studied. You can tell that there's a lot of attention to style and form. Then maybe, in my experience, right, I do work with a lot of like community poets who maybe don't necessarily have that kind of background or training. And so there is a stark contrast in styles. And this is, both of them are very, well, you can tell, deliberate. And it's a kind of writing that you have to kind of sit with like multiple times to consider also how form affects content.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can really appreciate the craft in these poems. And I had mentioned that too, how like with a lot of these, I found myself just questioning a lot of those choices that were being made. Whereas before, I wouldn't pause too much with that stuff. Like I would
questioning in the sense of like, well, why is this like this, right?
Right.
Why
Like,
you
why
doing it
is this
way?
punctuation here? You know, why the use for the colons? You know, why the repetition of the number 7 or whatever? Like different things, and that I typically do question, but I don't spend too much time on.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm teaching poetry in the classroom. Like I tell my students not to focus on those things in the beginning, right? Because you then take away from the content, like you're saying, and from what the poem's doing as a whole. So I'm like, just wait. We'll talk about that later.
Right.
You know,
Initially, we encourage you to just feel it out first. Like get the feeling, the theme, the topic, you know, just
First
experience it
impressions.
first. Without having to stop to analyze.
right,
Because that comes later. Yeah.
right. But I was doing the opposite.
It's
with
kind of
this.
hard not to, right? If you're kind of used to it. And I guess the thing that trips me out is we do have access to the advanced reading copies, and so of course these are it's uncorrected proof. So sometimes, you know, this is kind of one of the funny things about art and poetry, like it could just be a typo, and here we are like analyzing, like, oh, did you see the way this period was like spaced two spaces over? What does it mean? You know, maybe it's like taking an extended breath, you know, and it's just like, oh, that needed to be corrected. So yeah, that's always the thing that trips me out about when we read these
Yeah.
and getting into that analytical mindset. It's like, wait a minute.
That's true.
But there are very obvious, like, deliberate choices too. Not to say that
Yeah.
we would not be like dissecting it in an unworthy way. The end.
Do you want to discuss some of the themes we see?
I guess just like there's such a big emphasis on like place. Or like the setting
Yes.
in a lot of them.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a lot of it's related to, but of the body, you know,
Yeah.
body as space.
Yeah.
I started thinking of Nas. Sleep is the cousin of death. Think of the blue scar.
And here it is.
So one of the things that Raina and I were talking about is we don't really know Aldo as well. So, there's to a certain extent, we're curious about the autobiographical elements, maybe pertaining to like loss, right? Seems like there's a lost brother here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reckoning with.
I don't know him too personally, but yeah.
So that makes its appearance all throughout the collection, right? To kind of answer go along with what you're asking right now, right? There's also a lot of attention to homophobia on the border. Like a lot of cultural elements of how that manifests. And a lot of it's done through like memory. And a very interesting creation of, I guess, a text within a text, right? This glossary of what has not been said, right? Or how does he phrase it?
Glossary for what you left unsaid.
For what you left unsaid.
Yes.
So again, thinking of just about how we use language and kind of thinking about the unsaid elements of language, I think there's a very interesting creation with this glossary, right? And he breaks down terms through memories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed those. Glossary for what you left unsaid. He has art. Give me a sec. Gaslight.
Border cities. Mad.
Lost. Yeah, it's really cool just to see what he's doing with these and the terms that he's choosing and how he separates them into like nouns and verbs and stuff, and he's creating his own sort of definitions, but not really. They're like you said, Richie, these memories and these like phrases that are linked to these terms and to this idea of art and loss, and
it's more of like
gaslighting.
I don't need a dictionary. This is how I've experienced it.
Yeah.
And it's like almost there's limits in language in just a clear-cut definition, but rather your experience colors it in such a unique, your own way.
Oh, and Puñal too. That's the first one. Yeah, that one I think sets us up for what these glossaries are meant to do or to evoke, right? Like this one's very specific in setting, like you guys are talking about, strong imagery, violence, strong language, those specific memories in Juarez and downtown, the Mariscal, the alleyways. It's just dark, this dark definition of what puñal means to the speaker.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I was picking up on stuff I hadn't even realized, And again, I think a good poetry collection, or I guess good reading, anything, right, will teach you as well.
Yeah.
Before we, I guess, if we do decide to dive into them, in a general sense, and I was talking about this again earlier, off the show. Man, this makes no sense to keep referring to that, right? But even with like the first couple poems, there's this very strong sense of how he's establishing form, but kind of breaking through that form as well. And there's this strong sense of enjambment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's when, an idea will continue on to the next line. And I think in a very interesting way, he'll create obstacles in a line or break it up, whether it be ending like with the period, using all sorts of different types of punctuation or lined breaks or stanzas. And regardless of those stoppages, they're still connected, right? So there's an interesting sense of enjambment.
Yeah.
And when there's, I think again, which again draws attention to the craft of it all, where I think the first piece that lives outside, right, of the sections, Litany with burning fields, No, when I think of litany, I just think of the repetition, the repetitiveness, and of course, I think it kind of gives us the theme for a lot of the poems we read in these sections, right? Hence, that's the litany, right? The kind of repetition of it all, linking death with sleep, reference to loss of a brother, also loss of a grandfather, which comes up as well, right? And then, of course, the way the lines are broken up, they flow into each other a lot. And where you can read it in multiple ways, right? You see that. And then even in section 1, starting there, I love the fact that the beginning is called endings, right? A little river run past Eve and Adam, man. So here, right, you have similar lines moving on, right? That also could be read one way, like fragmented like that, but also it's read all the way
Together,
through, a continuance of the thought. So again, I think it's so, the sense is so strong that I found myself too, like I normally want to just kind of read it first, but since it's so strong, right, the sense of form, like, oh, why is it, oh, this is interesting, my mind wants to stop and start analyzing right away. Why is it, oh, why is it this way, like, which I find fascinating.
Same. Yeah. I loved this one.
Why did you love it?
For me, what really stood out about this one was like the hunger and like the wanting, both like in an actual like eating kind of hunger, but also like hunger for like change in your life, for like wanting something different for yourself. And I liked the way that those were kind of like both included in here.
Yeah, I like that imagery. There's some really great imagery too there. That I just think you have to experience reading, like before sunrise, plucked from the corners of the mountain, thinking of like the way the fog sits. Some mornings we'll have foggy mornings, and just such a surreal way of living. If especially here where we don't get that much of it.
Yeah. I like as you were talking about being so immersed in like a poem, but then also being distracted by I was writing in my book about the prepositions here, like that he starts sentences or lines with, of the day, of someone I'd rather keep, on earth I want, right? Like all these very choppy phrases that work in this poem, but when you're trying to teach poetry and in an English class and they're like, but that doesn't make sense. And you can't start a sentence with of, and it's like, well, I know,
break
but
all
in
the rules of like
poetry, you kind of can, and that's what's cool about it. So, but it's also, supposed to distract you in the best of ways and make you think about.
And that is what good art
purpose.
does, right? It changes the perspective, right? Again, so here, again, like the last stanza, right? Look at it. It's so chopped up in heartache or headache. The sea and the sun, for instance. The quiet, nestle of clouds falling down the pits of my body. Now that's read as it's chopped up, but you read it more naturally, right? Because even the stanza continues from the previous one, again, talking about the flow, right? Or rather, a thing that doesn't end in heartache or a headache. The sea and the sun, for instance, the quiet nestle of clouds falling down the pits of my body. So,
Yeah.
it's kind of, that's great,
My favorite lines were, I want a different ending, or rather a thing that doesn't end.
Which I think is a very universal want, right? Lovely. And next is this is one of my favorites, the Abad, and we have encountered Abad before, named as such, right? Some are always hungry. Yeah, it took me a while. I'm like, we've been reading a lot of books on this show now, right? Do you remember that one?
I do remember that one.
Nice. And this is also one where I referenced that I had already read before, when it was published. Yeah, I'm referencing Some Are Always Hungry by Ji Hyun Yoon. And here we have an abad, and this more of the want, right? And it's such a great discussion, I think, like of a moving of a city at change. And it's so visual that in my mind, I just envisioned the time lapse, right? And the way he's describing of like two new building towers and trees coming out of a parking lot, like just turning into a park. It's an interesting way to look at the passage of time. And the viewer, the voice is kind of like first person when you're experiencing it, right? It change in fast motion, like a time lapse. And that's the way I experienced this poem.
Yeah, I really enjoy the setting here, and that's something you were talking about earlier, Vanessa, about like just setting in place being so prevalent in the collection. And we see it all over, in the city, room, like clubs, motel rooms, pavement, old cinema, hospital room, strange road. Like I circled all of these words because of all these places that the speaker was trying to get us to think about, right? And like those changes. And it was really cool. I really enjoyed this one too.
Yeah, I like the way that you described it as a time lapse. Like you said, like you're experiencing it. So it's like living day-to-day life and like going through the city. So like all these settings are changing, but like you're still there. And like there's like a scene, I want to say there's so many scenes that like show that in movies. I'm trying to think of a specific one.
Yeah, I think it also captures this unrelenting search for like this yearning, right? And I think it captures it so well too, in your wanderings, in your day to day. And I guess even the opening lines, right, kind of reference that. In this city, each door I cross in search of your room. Like I love that. And again, of course, that leads into the next stanza so perfectly.
That's interesting. So you guys are reading it like with the emphasis on the speaker. So like when you're thinking of your scene, I'm thinking like of that scene where it's like when you were talking about it of like a person and then the background's all blurry because everything's like moving behind them and the city is just like,
visually, yeah.
But also like the thing that stood out to me the most is the setting and the places. So for me, I'm emphasizing more on the background than on the subject or the person.
Yes.
Right. So it's an abad, right? Which is like a morning after poem, right? A morning love song, like after a night spent with a lover, right? And that's referenced here. What is it? Talking about bed sheets doubling you, your maleness discharge, your hip bones sticking to my thighs, hearts over your legs, which again in reference to the body, the whole eroticism of it, right? And just again moving and again just searching through. So I'm guess I'm applying it with the concept of it being an abad, right? I'm envisioning the speaker navigating through the city of change, right? Just consistently becoming other things.
I get it. Speaking of time lapse, on page 20 for inheritance, I really like how this one also feels like a time lapse, but in a very different way.
Oh yeah, dramatic one.
I really enjoyed the pacing in this one. It's also really focused on memory and like intimacy. This one's probably my favorite. Well, from the first two, because I haven't finished the collection, but this one's probably my favorite one. Just because I really enjoyed the imagery here. I think it's beautiful and intimate and personal. And it's a different subject than the previous poems that have been a little bit more about love and loss and different things, but this one's more about like the speaker and his mother and their sort of ritual with each other. And I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I really like this one. What did you guys think about Inheritance?
It was a good contrast from the rest, yeah. But this one's like the speaker with their mother. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of poems throughout the collection that I noticed that reference her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's probably also why it stood out to me.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of mentions of the father, I think.
And brother.
The brother.
And grandfather.
And grandfather.
Yeah.
And lover.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so this is the first one with like mother. I'm like, oh, interesting.
Well, that's kind of one of the things that's I guess mirrored from the beginning of the piece to the end of the piece, with the transition where they've switched places, mm-hmm. right? And mm-hmm. she's brushing his, head, and then later he is. And again, you're talking about that time lapse, right? Again, the imagery of I mean, before you get to even that part, again, there's the intimacy of the body invoked, right? Mm-hmm. Mountain of scabs, stale rivers of spit and urine, a dust of dead cells, bones spreading the tinted meat of muscle and tendon. Kind of the description, right, of self, right? But I like, mm-hmm. again, the imagery of my heart's beating and slowing. I take my first step, ride my first bike, learn to drive a car. Like just that immediate succession of boom, boom, mm-hmm. boom, time. But then again, transforming that from car to car crash, but in this case, crashing into strangers.
Yeah.
So no longer strangers, which I love that line.
I loved that whole section.
Yeah. And then it brings it back to the reversal. Now time has passed and they switch places and mm-hmm. the inheritance, right? That genetics, right? The taking care of your mother now. Term.
Yeah, I think that's a great title because it's very loaded, right? Inheritance, something that is given to you, something that oftentimes like you can be proud of or you feel is like your duty. I don't know. I feel like it's a loaded term and it really works well here, especially with like the role reversals like you were talking about, Richie. I know you were talking about imploded Villanelle earlier, Richie. Was it just kind of as an aside for the presence of form and then playing with form mm-hmm. that you were talking about?
Yeah, it's a great title too. It sounds so cool. Mm-hmm. Imploded Villanelle, and again, which is a poetry form. Did you guys write any Villanelles in your class when you took?
Yes, we read some.
You read some? Okay.
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember which one it was.
Putting you on the spot.
I know. Sorry, Aldo.
There's a couple of famous ones. Dylan Thomas. I like Elizabeth Bishop's One Art.
That's the one we read.
That's such a classic poem. I really love it. And I forget that's a Villanelle. Mm-hmm. But when researching Villanelle, it shows up like, oh, that's right.
My students like that one too.
Yeah. I think when I taught poetry, the poetry class at UTEP, that was also, I think that drew like really great that class discussion. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Right. But yeah, that one's, that's the beginning of part 2, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're just skipping a bunch here. But for the sake of time, because we do have, there's a lot. But again, we did mention the glossary, what's left unsaid. There's some, I think, some interesting allusions that I think are noted upon, worth talking about. But I think there's a specific instance to a case here in El Paso of a soldier murdering a trans person. Eric, I forgot her last name. But it's mentioned in the notes. So, I mean, there's some other research or historical references as well related to maybe homophobia, not just in Mexico, but even in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things you'll see in here.
That one's on page 9, right? Is that the one you're talking about?
One of many, but right, there is an actual note there at the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even mentions other countries where you have a death penalty for people in same-sex relationships. So, and this one stood out to me because it's another instance of kind of the line just blowing through set boundaries, right? Because in this case, it's numbered, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And you think they would be different. Each one would have like a different topic or line or theme, but you kind of can read it all the way through.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting way to present it to be read. And of course, there's a number of 41 invoked, which I think is great because in the next poem after that is 42. Just kind of speed running through this, I guess.
A little bit.
But only to encourage, we've said it before, but experience them being read. That's one of the best parts, I think, about reading poetry. Is the personal experience of like unraveling it yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
But Unplugged VNL, that is the beginning of section 2, and it's just pretty much a different take on that form. And instead of being broken up into stanzas of 3-line stanzas in a quatrain, it's all like more in a paragraph form. Again, imploded, so it's all crushed together. I don't know what you guys think about that. There's, again, some great imagery in this one. Like this idea of a universe being a whole person, and when you lose that person, you lose the whole universe, or in this case, he uses the phrase like fitting a whole universe inside an urn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite lines was when the blood from the heart clots with the urn. Like that question too at the end where there's an address to a daughter, right?
Yeah.
And it's just more of the imagining the future, thinking of the future, right? Who will place my picture in the altar when the whole universe exists inside an urn, right? When it's my time, when it's my turn, who's going to? And I like how the picture here also invokes another poem later on. And I think it's the last one that we had in this first half. Speaking of his grandmother at night in the kitchen, hearing the grandfather in the picture. So I think that's I think it's Chuck Gon who talks about wormholes, or like how images in a collection are almost kind of even like there's a lot of similar imagery, so they're like loopholes from one thing to the next.
Yeah.
So seeing the picture here, or reading about the pictures in that poem, kind of took me to this part of Imploded VNL. If you had
and as like part of the Day of the Dead celebration, commemoration, I think it's important to note like the power that the personal items hold in the photographs, and further the souls of the dead, right? So when he's talking about like a whole universe fitting inside of an urn, I think it's a beautiful image, but it's also kind of him showing like how all of this is still existing after death. I like that it ends with the question. I love when poems end with questions. But it's a repetition also about the grain of salt expanding and contracting.
So the next piece kind of definitely echoes a lot of the other pieces we've read, especially as it pertains to Juarez, sister cities.
Yeah.
Just acknowledging the violence and I think we've seen this before, the desert as a
character.
right.
Yeah.
It's gluttonous, you're an appetite. Being home to these people that have lost. And this one hits a little hard too, where I think he personalizes some stories, right?
Yeah, this one also stood out to me. Obituaries for the Unnamed, because of the realness of it, like the femicides, the immigrant struggle, sacrifice, all that kind of thing.
And just, I guess, struggling with sometimes the distance that maybe we may have reading about it or hearing about it on the news. It's kind of the way it ends, right? Just,
yeah.
Wait, did I read that right?
Yeah.
Well, it's
in the last stanza.
Oh, yeah, listen to the news again. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved the imagery in this one. It's just so strong.
I mean, it's brutal. Like, I mean, some of it, I just think, like, the transformation of, like, the woman, you know. When you were talking about playing around with form, you guys were talking about the Gaslight poem, right? Gloss free what was left unsaid. And again, so the form is, I don't know if we mentioned it, right? But we did allude to it, but I don't know how specific we were. But in a lot of these poems that have that similar title, gloss free what was left unsaid, and then of course you have the term. You have like any dictionary, you have the word, and then whatever word of use or usage is, right? In this case, this one's interesting. It's 3 columns, 3 separate columns, and you guys talked about the possibility of it being
palindrome.
palindrome.
Yes.
I was thinking of. Never mind. It's gonna derail the conversation.
Okay.
Community Chang calls it a palindrome. I mean a palomino. A palomino. It's a palomino. And when it's not even. It's again. I derailed the conversation. So
Yeah.
this will be for me to edit out. Chop chop.
Yeah, I had that question because this one's different from the other terms in the glossary. I don't know if that's correctly identifying that, but yeah, there's 3 columns here, and I just thought, well, could this be a palindrome poem where we can read it from left to right, right to left, up, down, first column, second, third, second, first, I don't know. So I tried reading it and I felt like it worked. Richie didn't. No, I'm just kidding.
He disagreed.
They're lying.
Vanessa was like, yeah, it's totally a palindrome. So I felt pretty proud of myself for figuring that one out. No, I don't know. I mean, we can ask Aldo, of course, but I think it's cool. I think it's cool just, again, to see how he's playing around with form in a lot of these, and that even though they're all part of this like glossary, they don't all have to have the same format, and they don't. But I'm curious to see why Gaslight was done in this format, the structure.
I mean, even just our discussion, it's interesting. Gaslighting has to do with like what is truth and how do we, misrepresent truth, and the way it's broken up, it could be read different ways. It's very much a gaslighting tactic.
And here it says a noun as a verb.
And a verb, yeah.
So
it's cool.
Yeah.
City and border, so that's also examined, and more great imagery here as well. Speaking of like lovers throughout time, like the imagery of like the blue and red lights, flickering police lights. Kind of has its presence. But whenever you do have like police vehicles, emergency vehicles, it does fill up neighborhoods. It gives it an interesting presence, right?
Yeah.
And even more so when it's like just part of you're used to it, right? It's kind of one of the things that's talked about here. And Just like the way he talks about in the first section. One of the definitions of city. Right. Look, talking about, I saw your face flash. Blue, red, blue. That was pretty nice.
I also thought it was interesting that this one is specifically for someone, whereas the collection itself isn't necessarily dedicated to anyone.
Is that because it's an uncorrected proof and he doesn't have a dedication yet?
It might be that.
Or it might be just
It might not be that.
Yeah.
So these are all
That's
great
interesting.
questions to ask if we do get him on the show. And then since he's a local author, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't, right? So we should write these down so we don't forget. Hint.
Vanessa.
I'm writing it down.
So, I don't know if you guys have anything to say about what I say to my mother.
I like this one because of like the relatability of being in a situation like that. So the title is What I Say to My Mother After Her Father Dies is Soft. And it bleeds into the poem, which I also love when poem titles do that.
Yeah.
But I like the how should I say it? Like, it's very raw and like, here's what I wanted to say and here's what I meant to say. But it didn't come out that way because I've never been in this situation and it's awkward AF.
It's an exploration of like wow, why did I say that?
Yeah.
I really like the rhythm that it ends in. And the imagery of, that hospital room, right? Of the monitor, the lack, the beat, the lack, the beat. Da-da, da-da, da-da. Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting, the connection between the two on these pages, right? Because then the next one also kind of has to do with like hospital related or, again, MRI, but these hypotheticals. And in this one, right, you see like you don't see a whole lot of this in too much poetry. This I guess you would call it a pipe. I don't know, what do you guys call that symbol? It's like a divider, right? It actually has a name. Starts with an S. I can't remember it right now.
I just call them breaks.
Breaks. Yeah, it's the vertical line. I guess it's called a Sheffer stroke. But I think that's an application more for like philosophy equations. Right, which is that straight line. I use it when I promote like open mics and stuff. I use it to make a break too, to divide like stuff. But it's a nice line, but you don't see its presence a whole lot. But you use a nice scissor break here, right? And breaks. That's a couple times too throughout the collection. Why are you mad? So more glossary entries.
I do see the number 7 coming up a lot in a lot of these poems.
Oh, I didn't pick up
I
on
think
that.
Mad was my favorite one of the glossaries.
Mad. Oh,
Why-
yeah.
Why is that?
It made me feel mad. Like these memories, like, I don't know. Like I read them and I was like, I'm also mad. Like this happened to the speaker. And it wasn't like something that they deserved and they're mad about it. And like kind of like the healing from trauma, like you have to get mad first.
There's there's a lot in it too, right? Again, all the sections that included. You mentioned 7, so that appears in this one.
I want to know why 13 is blank. On page 40.
Right, I was looking at that. As you were saying, it's right before the apology, which maybe part of the process is not
Like,
sharing, just for yourself. Or maybe it's part of
like,
the uncorrected proof.
you have to calm down and then apologize.
Yeah, it's like be mad, allow yourself to get mad at these things, think about them, and then,
Like, take a breath.
Take a breath. That's maybe what 13 is, right? Take a beat and then apologize.
Take a beat. I'm going to use that. Someone's going to steal one of my beats. Yeah, no, that stands out too, the emptiness of that 13th line. Wow.
I also liked 9. That one was good too.
Playing around with a little bit of language there, right? Hole and hole. It's italicized, right? Again, the form is just do so much, just shifting around like that. The next piece does that too. When on loss. It's numbered. It's like a list now. It's like an outline. Elegy with the dial-up connection was probably also one of my top in this section, the first half.
Yeah, this one was very visual. Like I felt like I was there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's not as broken up as a lot of the other poems so far, right? I think it does build scenes and images a little bit more steadily, right? Including just this concept of grandmother being up at Lee in the kitchen and hearing his voice and his description and understanding of that. And then I guess even the ending, right, of him standing there in the darkness of the kitchen again. You mentioned darkness, Raina, right? All throughout. We haven't talked about it in the poems, but yeah, it's there a lot.
Yeah.
Darkness, shadows.
Shadows, darkness, right? Edges. And you hear him listening for the rasp in the grandfather's voice. And seems like there's a lot there too, a lot of unresolved stuff. For sure.
Like especially with the repetition of "I was not home." It comes out a couple of times.
Yeah. And that closes out the second part.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, so these come at you pretty fast, strong, and a lot of strong connections in a lot of the pieces. But again, I think, like we mentioned throughout the show, I think just the experience of navigating the form and how it affects the content, right, is just, you got to experience it, right?
Yeah.
And enjoy it ultimately, because I know we are. Maybe we're not talking, like we're not being as analytical, but it's fun to talk about these.
Yeah. There's also just so much going on throughout each of these poems.
But you do have to read them and kind of sit with them for a while.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Do any of these pieces remind you of... Wait, so in your class, did you guys do more reading than writing? Or did you write as well?
It was Both.
Both? Okay.
Yeah. We would read like 2 or 3 pieces for each class. And then we had like a weekly writing assignment.
And so would the writing be kind of centered around the stuff you read then?
Yeah, like implementing one of the techniques that they used, or he would sometimes give us a different prompt too.
Cool. Do you kind of see where I'm going with this?
Where are you going?
So quiz time. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Pop quiz.
Pop quiz. No, just I don't know if you picked up on any techniques or poetic techniques or terms or tools that maybe you studied in your class.
Yes,
that
actually,
show up prominently
there's
in here?
one poem that I can't remember off the top of my head. Oh my god.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? I can like see the book in my hands.
Really? Because I can't.
I know.
It's your phone in your hand.
Vanessa, that's your phone.
Oh my gosh, what was it called? It had like...
Or what do you remember about it?
It was from this one collection that had a poem. I think it was called like Triptych. I'm trying to look for it.
You failed.
I know, I'm doing so terribly.
Diana
Diana Coy Nguyen. A lot of the stuff that, like, all of the techniques that she used, like the breaking up of the poems, was in that. I think also like the use of punctuation, and I can hear him reading it.
Yeah.
It's kind of similar to the way that like Jericho Brown reads his work, and he is also one of the other authors that has a blurb on this collection.
All right. Nice mentioning that.
Yeah. I know one of his favorite authors is Ocean Vuong. So I kind of see that a little bit, but not too much, I don't want to say.
Okay.
But I do see, Ocean
Some influence.
Vuong. Yeah.
That's cool.
When I read this, it does really show the craft of poetry, you know, and the kind of stuff that I wish, like, a lot of people go to the open mics, like, there's a little bit more to it, you know, to the craft. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Than just like writing down your feelings.
So I think most people go with like a confessional type, which is still legitimate, but I mean, there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
You know, which I think if you're talking about craft, eventually you find yourself learning these things and coming across them and trying to apply them. So,
Well, a lot of people don't have that privilege to take a creative writing class at a university level.
no, but I mean, just being able to like read it, like I
For
think,
sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Read it and kind of try to understand like the techniques and there's so much that we can do
Yeah.
outside of that.
And I like that he explores all of these different techniques and different styles throughout the collection, rather than kind of like having one specific style, and like just perfecting it and like having it throughout the collection. It's kind of like all of these different, not to say that these aren't perfect, but like, he's just experimenting with different styles and everything.
It's definitely a nice experiment of how good he is with the craft.
Yeah.
I agree.
All right, so I guess in the second half, next episode.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Pass and brought to you by Border Census. This episode, we began our discussion on Brother Sleep by Aldo Amparán. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode and follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.
All right, I'm turning this off.